With any temperament that we use, we are necessarily making some sort of a compromise. And this has to do with the fact that when we try to tune pure intervals, we are always going to run into some trouble with our octaves. What I mean by this is that if we take our two main consonant intervals, the major third and the perfect fifth, if we tune them pure, octaves are not actually going to be in tune. To make the problem even worse, each one of those two intervals is pushing and pulling the octave in two different directions. If you tune pure major thirds, the octaves are going to be too narrow. If you tune pure perfect fifths, the octaves are going to be too wide. So this is the reason we use temperaments. What we're basically trying to do is temper these intervals, especially the thirds and the fifths, so that we can have pure, or rather good sounding octaves. The question is, of course, how you do it, and this is why there is such a variety of temperaments out there. And as I said, each one of them is making some sort of a compromise. Now, with the equal temperament that we're using today, what we do is that we take pure perfect fifths, and as I said, if you tune pure perfect fifths, then your octaves are going to be too wide. So what we do is we take that discrepancy, in other words, that wideness between what we would like the octave to be and what it is, and we spread it out among the 12 perfect fifths. So what you have is then 12 narrowed fifths, and this is what gives us the equal temperament that we have. Now, by doing so, by narrowing the fifths equally, what happens is that we run into a different sort of trouble, and we really make a very big sacrifice. What I mean by this is that, on the one hand, when you narrow the fifths, when you concentrate so much on one part of the problem, the thirds become very, very wide. And if you're used to pure major thirds, equally tempered thirds don't sound that great. The other thing that happens, and I think this is something that we have really lost in the 20th century, is the notion of temperament having expression, having an expressive potential. You've probably heard the idea of key color, and that different keys have different properties, different expressive properties. This is because when we use equal temperament, what happens is that all the fifths are narrowed equally. This gives us equidistant half steps, and it means that all major scales sound exactly the same, and all minor scales also sound exactly the same. So there is absolutely no key color. All the keys, all the major scales sound the same, all the minor scales sound the same. Now, there's a myth out there that says, yes, we're doing this, but on the other hand, equal temperament enables us to play in all keys. Well, actually, there are unequal circulating temperaments, or well temperaments, think Bach's well-tempered clavier, that also allow us to do this. The difference between a circulating unequal temperament and the equal temperament that we use now is that with the unequal circulating temperaments, you can still play in every key, but we still retain some purity of some intervals a little bit, and at the same time, the fact that not all intervals are the same, it means that different keys have different characteristics. They sound different. Not every major key sounds the same. Not every minor key sounds the same. So this kind of key color is something that we have totally lost in the 20th century. Now, the further back you go, you find that musicians were trying to retain more purity, as many pure intervals as they could. which means that we almost run to the opposite extreme, let's say, from equal temperament. What I'm thinking now are the two temperaments that I'm going to use to play this piece by Giovanni Maria Trabaci, which I will talk about later. And those are two types of meantone temperaments: quarter comma meantone temperament and third comma meantone temperament. Now, what those two temperaments do, quarter comma meantone temperament, or more commonly known simply as meantone temperament because it's the most common of the meantone temperaments, tries to retain as many pure major thirds as possible. So we have 8 major thirds that are pure, to the detriment of some other things, and which I will talk about. And then with third comma meantone temperament, we have 9 pure minor thirds, again to the detriment of some other things. Now, as I mentioned with equal temperament, the problem is you concentrate so much on the fifths that the thirds go totally out of whack, and then we miss any sort of key color. With these two meantone temperaments, because we concentrate so much on thirds, that means that the fifths would theoretically be out of whack. The thing is, musicians didn't want to make them too out of whack so that they would be somehow really unpleasant to listen to. So what they did is they changed them a little bit, they narrowed them a little bit, the fifths. However, they didn't narrow them enough because they didn't want them to sound too bad. So the discrepancy that remains was thrown into a particular fifth, which exists between, well, we would say A flat and E flat. However, because in meantone temperaments there is no such thing as enharmonics, each of the keys has one and only one particular function. What we're dealing with is G sharp to E flat, and it produces this diminished sixth that we call the wolf. I'll play it. I think I've done this before in previous videos, but I'll do it again so you get a flavor of what this sounds like. And if this sounds a little wolfier than what you're used to, this is because now the spinet is tuned to third comma meantone, and the wolf in third comma meantone is a little wider than quarter comma meantone. So this is one thing that happens, and of course this means that opposite from equal temperament, here now we're dealing with certain tonalities that are simply not playable. So for us, you may think, okay, well, this is a big disadvantage because I can't modulate everywhere I want to, and of course there are certain keys that I can't even play in. If you think back into the idea of enharmonics, well, as I mentioned, this is G sharp. This means that you don't have A flat in this temperament. You can pretend that you do, but you really don't. So you cannot write in A flat major or A flat minor, for instance. So this we may think is a disadvantage. However, it doesn't have to be one, because think about it. Let's say you want to write an instrumental piece that you want to express something unpleasant, or you want to express despair, for instance. How do you do it? Well, go to those tonal areas, go to those tonalities and those combinations of intervals that don't sound that great, and suddenly you hear that despair. It becomes audible. And this is what I mean by temperament becoming expressive. It's not simply that you have key colors, but you have instances where you can exploit these so-called ugly sounding intervals, or the way I prefer to call them, spicy. You can explore that spice. You can explore that poignancy that comes from going into those intervals and those tonalities. And suddenly you have a very, very wonderfully expressive piece. And I would say, if you want to listen to examples of this, if you look back to some of my videos, you can listen to Louis Couperint's Pavane in F sharp minor, and also a saraband in C minor by Froberger, both of which I'm using quarter comma mean tone temperament. And you will see how this seemingly normal piece becomes something totally different and totally beautiful, just because composers, those two composers, are exploiting these forbidden areas of the temperament. Now, the other thing that happens with both of these mean tone temperaments, and as I mentioned, the spinet is now tuned to third comma mean tone, but this holds true also for quarter comma mean tone, is that you get a very, very characteristic chromatic scale, because what you have here is that the half steps are not equidistant. Let me play a 2-octave chromatic scale starting on C, and you will see what I mean. You simply don't get that wonderfully sexy flavor in equal temperament. There is no such thing. So, at any rate, the piece that I wanted to play is called Consonanze stravaganti by the Italian composer Giovanni Maria Trabaci. And I would say that these extravagant consonances really have to do with the composer exploring the chromatic possibilities of mean tone temperament. Now, as with a lot of issues from the 17th century, we cannot be 100% sure which mean tone temperament, or rather even which temperament, Trabaci had in mind. But we have to keep in mind here, Trabaci was an organist. These pieces were not necessarily written for the organ. However, very, very likely they were performed on it. And although not every organ was tuned to quarter comma mean tone temperament, this particular temperament, quarter comma mean tone, was fairly common for that time. And to me at least, it's clear that Trabaci here, in order to achieve these extravagant consonances, is really asking for some type of temperament that has this kind of very flavorful chromatic scale, and also certain intervals that are not so pleasant. What I decided to do is perform the piece twice. First in quarter comma mean tone temperament, and then in third comma mean tone temperament. And I simply wanted you to listen and hear the differences between the two. They're both going to be very spicy. Both of them have very, very characteristic, shall we say, very individualistic chromatic scales. Third comma a little bit more so. Third comma also has a more howling wolf interval. But I wanted to perform it in both of those temperaments so that you get an idea of the possibilities of what is out there. So this was my little introduction. I hope you enjoy the performances, and as always, thank you for watching.
you.